My stepmom spent years treating me like a burden and wanted me gone. But when I revealed that I inherited the house, I made her choose. Now she's living under my rules. When I declined, she attempted to persuade my father to evict me. But once I disclosed the truth about the house's actual ownership, everything shifted. Sandra's grin stretched wider. Well, in that case, you'll need to find somewhere else to stay, won't you? We can't have freeloaders under this roof. I sat at the dining table, my meal untouched and cold, as her words lingered in the air. The unfairness of it all weighed on me. Years of being treated like a servant while her children contributed nothing. And now this? Something inside me finally snapped. So let me get this straight, I said, my voice unexpectedly steady. James, who completed college 2 years ago and spends his entire day playing video games, isn't required to contribute financially. Melissa, who's in her 3rd year of university and has never lifted a finger to help around the house, also isn't expected to pay. But I am? Sandra dabbed her lips with a napkin and replied coolly, I decided my kids shouldn't have to pay rent while they're still getting their footing. A strange sense of tranquility washed over me. Maybe it was years of pent-up frustration, or maybe it was just time for the truth to come out. I felt a smirk form on my lips. Not my usual forced smile to keep the peace, but something different. Something that made Sandra's own grin falter slightly. That's interesting, I said, leaning back in my chair. Because I'm not paying rent either. This house is legally mine. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then James burst out laughing, soon joined by Melissa's high-pitched giggle. Sandra chuckled as well, but there was a nervous undertone to it. What are you talking about? She asked, still forcing a laugh. I mean exactly what I said, I replied, holding her gaze. This house belongs to me. The laughter faded as the realization set in. Sandra's expression morphed. First, amusement, then confusion, then disbelief, and finally something that looked a lot like panic. That's absurd, she stammered, grabbing her phone. I'm calling your father right now. Her manicured fingers jabbed at the screen as she put the call on speaker. The ringing echoed through the kitchen. Hello? My father's voice crackled through. David? Sandra said, her tone tight and measured. Ruby is making some rather bizarre claims about the house. She insists it legally belongs to her. That's not true, is it? The silence on the other end stretched unbearably long. Then my father cleared his throat. Well, he hesitated. Actually, my in-laws transferred the house to Ruby's name before they passed. Sandra's face darkened. You didn't think, she practically shrieked. You didn't think this was worth mentioning? I didn't see it as important, my father admitted weakly. It never seemed relevant. Not relevant? Sandra's face turned crimson. Not relevant that your teenage daughter owns the house we live in? Before my father could reply, she ended the call with a frustrated slam of her phone against the table. The kitchen filled with an uneasy silence, broken only by the hum of the fridge. James and Melissa stared at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Sandra, breathing heavily, was clearly trying to collect herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was forcedly light, but there was an unmistakable tremor beneath it. Well, she let out a choked laugh. This is all just a silly misunderstanding. Of course you don't have to pay rent, Ruby. Let's just move past this, okay? I had completely lost my appetite. Without a word, I rose from my seat and made my way upstairs. As I climbed the steps, I could hear hushed whispers below. Sandra's sharp voice mixed with James and Melissa's anxious murmurs. By 6 the next morning, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling, processing just how drastically everything had shifted in a single night. Around 7, I heard movement downstairs, the familiar sound of Sandra brewing her morning coffee. I was about to head down for breakfast when her voice caught my attention. David, you need to do something about this situation, she said, her tone low but urgent. Your daughter, we just need her to leave. I froze on the stairs, holding my breath. I know the house belongs to her, Sandra continued, frustration seeping into her words. But she's making things complicated. She doesn't belong here anymore. She's becoming a problem. There was a pause. Even without seeing him, I could feel my father's hesitation. But Sandra, it's her house. I can't just force her out. Sandra's voice softened into that saccharine sweetness she used when she wanted something. Who said anything about forcing her out? We just need to guide her in the right direction. She applied to those out-of-state colleges, didn't she? Why don't you encourage her to go? Tell her it's good for her independence. My stomach tightened as my father finally gave a hesitant response. Maybe you're right, he murmured. I'll talk to her about leaving for college. It might be best for everyone. I waited until Sandra ended the call before stepping into the kitchen, keeping my expression neutral. I casually grabbed a bowl and poured myself some cereal, pretending I hadn't overheard anything. James and Melissa wandered in moments later, both visibly uneasy. Sandra entered last, still gripping her phone. "Good morning, everyone," she chirped, as if nothing had happened the night before. We all sat down, the only sounds in the room coming from the crunch of cereal and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. Then, as effortlessly as if I were commenting on the weather, I spoke. "Oh, and starting next month, all of you will be paying rent." The silence was instant and suffocating. I could hear the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Sandra stared at me as if I had started speaking in an unfamiliar language. James and Melissa froze, their spoons suspended in midair, exchanging nervous looks. It was Sandra who finally shattered the silence with a forced laugh, though it wavered, at the edges. "You're joking, right?" she asked, her voice almost childlike, clinging to control. "No, Sandra, I'm completely serious." My tone was even, but there was no mistaking the steel behind my words. "You've all lived here rent-free for years. It's time to start contributing." Sandra swallowed, struggling to regain her composure. "That doesn't make any sense. We're family." "No, we're not," I interrupted, my patience gone. "You made that perfectly clear when you demanded that I pay rent while your children did nothing. From now on, everyone will be held to the same standard." James scoffed, attempting a nonchalant shrug, but the nervous edge in his expression betrayed him. "This is ridiculous. I'm not paying anything." I met his gaze without flinching. "Then you're welcome to find somewhere else to live." Melissa, who usually stayed out of confrontations, finally spoke. "But I'm still in college. How am I supposed to afford rent?" I raised an eyebrow. "Maybe you should have thought about that before spending all your money on parties and designer clothes." Then, before she could argue, I added, "But don't worry, the rent will be reasonable. I'll even help you find a job." Sandra snapped, slamming her hand down on the table. "You've completely lost it. This house has always been a home, for all of us. I won't let you turn it into some kind of ridiculous rental property." I stared at her, unmoving. Then I smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her expression tighten. "Funny hearing that from you, Sandra," I said, "because just yesterday I heard you trying to convince my father to push me out of my own house. And you really thought I wouldn't find out?" The color drained from Sandra's face, leaving her momentarily speechless. Melissa looked as if she might faint, while James stared down at his plate, seemingly wishing he could vanish. I was only trying to help you become more independent," Sandra stammered, her voice laced with forced composure, attempting to hide her growing panic. "Oh, of course. Independence," I echoed, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "How thoughtful of you to try and push me out of the house my grandparents left to me, all while you and your children continue living here rent-free." She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to silence her. "Don't bother. I've already made my decision. If you want to stay, you'll all be signing formal rental agreements. From now on, it'll be on my terms." Sandra shot up from her chair, desperate to regain control. "This is completely unacceptable. David would never allow it." I leaned back, unbothered. "Maybe you should call him again and see what he thinks. Or better yet, ask him what he'll do when I decide to evict everyone and sell the house." The way her face paled was almost satisfying. She knew I had the power to do exactly that, and the realization visibly rattled her. That night, I stayed in my room, listening to the hushed murmurs and tense arguments drifting up from downstairs. Sandra was no doubt scheming, scrambling for a way out of this mess, but what she didn't know was that I was more than ready for whatever she had planned. The next morning, I called for a family meeting. Sandra tried to refuse, but I made it clear she had no choice. By 10 a.m., we were all gathered in the living room, Sandra, James, and Melissa looking tense and uncomfortable, while I sat with unwavering confidence. I placed a stack of papers in front of them. "These are your rental agreements," announced, my voice steady. "You have 1 month to decide if you want to stay." Sandra hesitated before picking up the contract, her hands trembling slightly. As her eyes moved down the page, her face grew redder by the second. "This is outrageous. You can't do this," she snapped. I met her furious gaze head on. "Actually, I can. I own the house." James, his frustration boiling over, threw his contract onto the floor. "This isn't fair. We're your family." I let out a humorless chuckle. "No, James. You, Melissa, and Sandra treated me like hired help for years. If you want to continue living here, you'll pay like everyone else." The argument dragged on for hours, filled with protests, guilt-tripping, and desperate bargaining. But I stood firm. In the end, Sandra finally realized she had no way out. Before storming out of the room, she delivered one last bitter remark. "You'll never have your father's support after this." I simply smiled, exhausted but resolute. "We'll see." Over the following days, she tried everything, manipulating my father, stirring up tension in the house, even attempting to turn James and Melissa against me. But no matter what she did, it didn't work. In the end, they All signed the contracts, and the first rent payments arrived the next month. For the first time in years, I was in control. And for the first time, I didn't care what they thought. I had the house, the authority, and, most importantly, my peace of mind. As the months passed, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly strained. At first, Sandra, James, and Melissa pretended nothing had changed. They grudgingly paid the first month's rent, perhaps assuming I'd eventually change my mind. But I didn't. Soon, the payments started arriving late, first by a few days, then weeks. The excuses were always the same: unexpected expenses, temporary financial struggles, bad timing. But I knew better. James stopped buying his expensive games, spending more time sulking in his room. Melissa no longer flaunted new clothes and barely went out. And Sandra seemed to be unraveling before my eyes, her once composed demeanor replaced by sheer exhaustion. Deep shadows framed her tired eyes, and it was clear that the weight of the situation had taken its toll. Realizing it was time to bring this ordeal to a close, I decided to settle things once and for all. On a rainy evening, I gathered everyone in the living room. The air was thick with tension. My father sat on the couch, looking utterly defeated, while Sandra stood stiffly, arms crossed, clinging to an authority she no longer held. James and Melissa, as expected, kept their heads down, avoiding my gaze. "It's been 3 months. Since you've paid your rent in full," I began, my voice steady but unwavering. "I could evict all of you without a second thought." Sandra's eyes widened in disbelief. "You wouldn't dare!" I met her stare, my expression devoid of emotion. "Don't underestimate just how much I've tolerated, but I'm willing." To be fair, I shifted my gaze to my father. "I won't ask you to pay rent, not because you can't afford it, but because I know you've been manipulated. Out of respect for you, I'll take that burden off your shoulders." My father lifted his head, surprised by my words, but remained silent. He knew I was right. "But you, Sandra," I continued, locking eyes with her, "that's a different story. For years, you treated me like a servant, barking orders while your children did nothing. So I've come up with a solution, one that's fair." I let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "You can stay, but instead of paying rent with money, you'll pay with labor. You'll clean the house, do the laundry, cook, all. The things you once demanded of me, you'll be the maid." Sandra's face drained of color. She lifted a trembling hand to her mouth as if trying to suppress the panic rising within her. "You're joking," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not," I responded without hesitation. "And to make sure there's no confusion, you'll wear a proper maid's uniform, black dress, white apron, hairnet. If you're going to work, you'll do it properly." For a moment, she stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the humiliation. Then, unable to hold back her tears, she turned desperately to my father. "David, are you really going to let her do this to me?" My father shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. I exhaled, my patience running thin. "Dad, with all due respect, stay out of this. You know why I'm sparing you, but Sandra has to face the consequences of her actions." He lowered his head in resignation. Sandra stood there, silently sobbing. Melissa looked ghostly pale, while James refused to react at all. Eventually, Sandra left the room in quiet defeat. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen. She was wearing the maid's uniform, a simple black dress with a neatly tied white apron around her waist and a hairnet keeping her hair in place. Her movements were mechanical as she wiped the counter, her expression utterly vacant. "Good morning, Sandra," I greeted her, my voice neutral. She didn't respond. I poured myself a glass of orange juice, sipping it slowly before, accidentally, letting it slip from my hand, the liquid splattering across the floor. "Oh dear, how clumsy of me," I murmured. "Could you clean that up, please?" For a brief moment, she remained motionless. Then, without a word, she knelt down and began scrubbing the floor. But that was only the beginning. At lunch, I made a point of sitting comfortably at the table. "Sandra, add more sauce to my plate, please," I instructed, watching her closely. "And be careful not to spill it." Her hands trembled as she served me, her silence heavier than any protest she could have made. I savored every second of the shift in power, not out of cruelty, but because justice was long overdue. Later that afternoon, I called her into the living room. "Sandra, the windows are filthy. Clean them." She hesitated. "It's already getting dark." I tilted my head slightly. I didn't ask for an excuse. "Unless, of course, you'd rather pay rent instead." Her face flushed with anger, but she bit her lip and grabbed the cleaning supplies. As she stepped onto the stool, beginning to wipe down the glass, I turned to James and Melissa, who sat watching uneasily. "You two could help," I remarked, my tone casual. "Or would you prefer to renegotiate your contracts with higher rent?" Without hesitation, they both scrambled out of the room. Sandra continued working in silence while I sat back and observed. That night, lying in bed, I stared up at the ceiling. I wasn't giddy with triumph, nor did I feel the slightest bit of guilt. What settled over me was something far more profound, a deep, unshakable sense of peace. Not revenge, not malice, just the certainty that, at last, balance had been restored. Sandra had received exactly what she deserved. My father had made his choice, and I had made mine. If anyone believed I was too harsh, so be it. No one else had lived through what I had. And now, for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let anyone take my peace away from me.